Welcome everyone, and welcome to the B2B Global Partnership thematic webinar series. My name is Pradeep Naik and I'm representing the B2B Global Partnership here, and I will be the host, introducing and facilitating the discussions today. So first, before I introduce our speaker today, I'm going to introduce the B2B Global Partnership briefly and also introduce the series itself. And then I'll hand it over to our speaker of the day today. So the Vulnerability to Viability V2V Global Partnership is a transdisciplinary research and knowledge network with over 100 members from Africa, Asia, Canada, and internationally. The goal of this partnership is to support small-scale fishers and communities in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we understand vulnerability is not just in the economic sense, but it includes cultural, political, and environmental and other aspects of human lives. So it's pretty comprehensive in the way that we look at and study and research and respond to vulnerability along with the communities. The V2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors, conditions contributing to the vulnerability of communities and small-scale fisheries around the world, and engage collaboratively with small-scale fishing communities and other key NGO, government, and university partners to enhance community viability. We are conducting transdisciplinary community-engaged research in 6 countries in Asia. That includes Bangladesh, India, Japan, Malaysia, and Thailand, and 6 countries in Africa. That includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. But it also includes many case studies and research endeavors around the world that is beyond these countries. In doing so, the V2B partnership brings people and organizations together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale communities. The V2B thematic webinar series, for which we have gathered here today, is an initiative of the partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and issues and topics within the context of small communities, but with focus on small-scale fisheries communities. The goal is to feature academics, policy practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries and small-scale communities around the world, both locally and globally. V2B thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday of every month, and it will take place throughout 2021. The series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube, details regarding which you can find on www.v2bglobalpartnership.org. That's our website. Today's talk is the 7th in the series of webinars planned for the year 2021, and it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Michaela Hynie as our distinguished speaker of today. Dr. Hynie is a professor in the Department of Psychology, York University, Toronto, Canada. She is also a member of the Center for Refugee Studies at York University. Dr. Hynie focuses on interdisciplinary, multi-methods, community-based research on social integration and inclusion with communities experiencing social conflicts or forced migration and displacement. Her work involves development and evaluation of social, institutional, and policy interventions that can improve health and well-being in different cultural, political, and physical environments. She has actively worked or working in Canada, in the DRC, India, Kenya, Liberia, Nepal, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and South Africa. And some of these countries are actually partner countries on the B2B partnership. As an extraordinary scholar, Dr. Hynie has made tremendous contributions to the field of migration studies, focusing on the health and well-being of the people that are on the move. and building resilience of migrant communities in both rural and urban community contexts. Her contributions include numerous publications and leading several international and national research initiatives. Dr. Hynie is the past president of Canadian Association for Refugee and Forced Migration Studies, and currently she is a co-investigator and member of the B2B Global Partnership, and we are proud of that. It is my honor to invite Dr. Michaela Hynie today to deliver a talk for the V2B thematic webinar series, and the talk is titled as An Intersectional Lens on the Costs and Benefits of Compelled Migration as an Adaptation to Environmental Degradation. Dr. Hynie, this is time for you to take the floor.
Thank you very much for that very generous invitation. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to try sharing my screen now, and I'm just going to ask that people confirm, Prateep, if you can confirm that you're seeing my slides correctly when I present them, and then I will continue.
Yes, we can see the slide, but if you can make it, yes.
So you're seeing the full slide?
Yes.
Fantastic, thank you. I apologize for the length of this title. I think I was free associating as I came up with it, and thinking, this was about a month ago, thinking about what I would speak about to this collection of individuals, because the work that I do tends to, especially recently, focus more on people who have been migrating as a result of conflict. And yet I have continued to be interested in people who are compelled to migrate as a result of environmental change. What I would like to do today is try to merge these interests and these literatures. And just as my title was a bit of a free association, this talk is also a bit of a free association. And so I would like to establish where I hope my stream of consciousness is going to be taking us. And I also hope that I have correctly said that I'm upstream, up at the positionality point. I spent some time looking at this river, trying to make sure I was reading it correctly. I would like to start by talking about my own background and training and the discipline that I have been reading, and how that is then going to inform what I'm going to be speaking about today. And because of that, I will then lead to a brief discussion of the different patterns of migration and how scholarship in different areas tends to focus on different patterns, and as a result asks different questions. I want to briefly then touch on why I think intersectionality brings a really important lens to thinking about environmental migration. And then finally, I want to focus specifically on the social and psychological costs and benefits, not because they are the most important, but because I think that is where I might be able to make the greatest contribution in this particular group, given that I assume that many of the people who are here today have much deeper knowledge than I do on the material consequences of environmental migration in their communities. So let me start with that issue of where am I coming from and how does that shape what I'm going to be speaking about today. I was originally trained in social psychology, and while I have left much of that behind, it has formed how I think about migration. My research has been very much focused on both migration, and this includes voluntary migration, but also compelled and forced migration, and particularly migration that's been forced through conflict, so refugees and refugee claimants. I also am interested in community development, both in countries that have experienced conflict and also in communities where we're bringing people together from many different settings, again, often through migration. Not surprisingly because of my background and my training, but also because of the topics I study, the focus I bring to this work is, on the one hand, how we can build and strengthen social networks, how these are a resource and how they are challenged and threatened through migration, and how they can be reinforced in community development, and also integration and belonging. So in communities where we see migration, either people leaving or people coming in, how do we ensure that all of the members of the community are fully integrated and belong and participate fully in the community? The final lens that I want to bring to this is one of the social determinants of health. I find the social determinants of health to be useful because it makes you think about the ways in which the factors we're studying have an impact on people's well-being. And I will speak more about the social determinants of health as we go through the talk. What I would like to do is try to, at various points in this discussion, bring in research of my own, but I'm going to try to focus on other people's research, applying the same kinds of lenses that we have used in our research, mostly with forced migrants. I'm going to be using the term environmental migration or environmental migrants to talk about people who are migrating as a result of environmental change. But I would like to point out that the area of environmental migration actually includes a broad range of experiences. The definition of environmental migrants is that it is persons or groups who are migrating because of either sudden or progressive changes in their environment. They are obligated to leave their homes in order to adapt to or respond to these changes, but they do so either voluntarily or they are compelled to do so. They do so temporarily or permanently or cyclically, and they can move within the boundaries of their own country or they can move across boundaries. So in fact, there is a huge range of possible migration responses that fall under the umbrella of environmental migration. I tried to actually map out all the different ways in which migration can happen, both in terms of the pattern of migration, in terms of the temporal dimension of migration, and in terms of the kinds of environmental change that are happening. And as you can see, there are many different possible combinations. But some combinations tend to co-occur more frequently than others. So people experiencing a sudden, extreme environmental change are more likely to be forced migrants who are compelled to move with very little choice. That move may be sudden, but it's also more likely to be temporary. Or people who are experiencing slow changes are more likely to be engaged in temporary migration or cyclical migration. And people who experience slow environmental degradation are more likely to be migrating within their international boundaries. Now, much of my work has focused on a much narrower definition of migration. And this is migration that's defined by the experience of conflict. The 1951 Refugee Convention has a very strict definition of who you would call a refugee. And this week I have been participating in the International Association of Studies in Forced Migration, which have focused, where the researchers typically focus primarily on refugees. And what they're looking at then is individuals who have a well-founded fear of being persecuted because of their social identity or their activities, and cannot rely on the protection of their country of origin, and are forced to cross international boundaries. Notice that this is a much narrower definition of migration than the definition that's included under environmental migration, and yet the conditions may be similar. Nonetheless, as a result of these different foci, we tend to see very different concerns among people who study conflict-induced migration versus those who study environmental migration. So scholars who look at conflict-induced migration are typically looking at forced migration. There's an assumption that people have very little choice, although of course not everyone leaves in the context of a conflict, so there is choice both about whether one leaves and when one leaves. Because migration is thought of as something that is forced and not really chosen, there's a real emphasis on mobility justice, people's right to migrate, and therefore on international borders and the securitization of those borders that prevent people from exercising their right to migrate as it is protected under these international treaties. The focus is on trying to find permanent solutions to conflict and to forced displacement and an end to migration, but that end to migration in many cases would ideally be an opportunity for permanent resettlement. Because of the nature of those lenses, we tend to look a lot at the rights and well-being of migrants who are in the process of migration or who are in asylum or in the process of resettlement. So often it's migrants who are our focus, and it is the stage after their departure from their country of origin that tends to be the focus of our work. For people who are studying environmental migration, there's a much broader range of types of migration that are under focus or in focus, but many of these migrations are more on the voluntary or compelled side. We're less likely to talk about it as being forced and more likely to talk about it as being compelled. So one doesn't have to move, but the conditions make moving perhaps the most adaptive option. Migration is often seen through a lens that is connected to adaptation to environmental changes or from a developmental lens. And so we think about how migration contributes to development. Migration in the environmental migration literature is often internal migration. So people are often migrating short distances within international boundaries. We frequently see short-term migration, or we see regular migration, where at a certain point in the year, individuals will migrate out and engage in other kinds of livelihoods and then return back. Environmental migration is often focused on the pre-migration conditions that result in people migrating out. So there's a much greater focus on pre-migration rather than post-migration outcomes. And therefore, the focus tends to be on the consequences for individuals, communities, and ecosystems in the site of departure, often more so than on the consequences for individuals who have departed. So the focus is on the site that people have left rather than on the location that people have migrated to. And again, I'm making sweeping statements. There's a lot of overlap between these two areas of research. Nonetheless, we do tend to see a different focus because of the different conditions that they tend to focus on. I just want to very briefly say that internal displacement is much more likely to be due to environmental change than it is to be due to conflict. So this is data looking at new internal displacements as a result of both different kinds of environmental disasters and conflict from the IDMC. And as you can see, floods and storms are the primary drivers of displacement in 2020, and conflict makes up only a tiny proportion of the drivers of internal displacement. And when you look at the statistics on displacement that is due to conflict, nonetheless, we see that a large proportion of the people who are displaced by conflict are displaced within international borders. So internal displacement is a significant component of forced displacement, just as it is, even though it's only a minor component of internal displacement overall. Nonetheless, and this is an interesting statistic, even though we know that environmental conditions seem to be drivers of displacement, and that those drivers of displacement are more prevalent, environmental drivers of displacement are more prevalent, at least within internal displacement, than conflict. When you ask people why they left their country, international migrants, why they left their country, the response that they give you tends to be that they left their country because of economic conditions. And then they will say, perhaps violence and conflict. And only a tiny proportion of people who are asked what the driver of their migration was will say that it was because of environmental stressors. So how do we reconcile the frequency with which the environment results in displacement and the relatively low frequency with which people talk about environmental stressors as the driver of their displacement? Is it because we're talking about international migration rather than internal displacement in this particular context? Possibly. One possibility is that because so much of internal displacement is actually cyclical or temporary, that the total number of people who are living in displacement is actually greater for people who've been affected by conflict than people who've been affected by disasters. That environmental conditions result in these cyclical or temporary migration patterns, and so we don't see prolonged states of displacement, as we do tend to see with conflict, where we see that as many as 30% of people who've been displaced by conflict have been displaced for 20 years or longer. The other reason is that these different kinds of forces that influence, or drivers that influence migration, interact with one another. So even if one is experiencing environmental changes, what might be most salient as the driver of migration is that one's livelihood is slowly eroding. So if you ask people why you left, you will say it's because I cannot feed my family. Possibly the reason you cannot feed your family is because of environmental displacement, but the answer to the question will be the more proximal cause. The other reason is that these different drivers of migration interact, so that environmental displacement, or excuse me, environmental factors aggravate conflict. They certainly aggravate one's livelihoods, or one's ability to maintain one's livelihood. Conflict affects environment and affects one's ability to feed one's family. And so all of these different factors intersect. I think ultimately what that means is that it's very difficult to talk about why exactly people have migrated. But we do know that environment plays a significant role in displacement. And perhaps less emphasis should be played exactly on whether environment is the ultimate cause, and more on just how environment is happening in situations of environmental change. It also suggests that we shouldn't be perhaps so focused on these different types of migration, and recognize that we're talking about continuums of displacement. And the scholarship of forced migration due to conflict and the scholarship of environmental displacement can perhaps learn from each other about how one can focus not only on the consequences of displacement, as we do in forced migration, but also on the consequences of migration on the people left behind and on the environments left behind. So what I'm hoping to do today is try to weave together some of the work that we have done around forced migration, or the questions that we ask in the context of conflict-induced migration, to the study of environmental displacement, and see if there might be something that is mutually beneficial in bringing these two literatures together. I now want to move on to this question of intersectionality, and why am I interested in bringing intersectionality into the question, or into the study of displacement? Intersectionality refers to our multiple social identities. We are made up of many different identities. I am a woman, I am a professor, I am a daughter. All of these different, I'm Canadian, these different identities shape who I am and are salient in different contexts. Our different identities shape the experiences that we have access to, the opportunities that we have available to us. But those opportunities differ depending on the context that we find ourselves in. So our opportunities and our well-being and our outcomes depend on our multiple identities and on who we are interacting with in what context. So intersectionality is not only about identities, it's also fundamentally relational. It's about how we relate to others in particular contexts. This is extremely relevant when we talk about the situation of migration, because migration, being an immigrant, is another social identity. And the moment that you engage in migration, you take on a new social identity, and you insert yourself into new social circumstances where this identity now plays a role. Your ability to engage in migration is also affected by your different positions, your different social identities. And I'd like to draw on an example taken from Chilika Lagoon, and taken actually from one of Pradeep Nayak's research projects there in that setting. And this is a study that was looking at women's perspectives on environmental change in Chilika Lagoon. And it was looking at two fisher communities that were made up of women from two different castes, a higher social caste, the Katia people, and a slightly lower social caste, the Kandra people. Both communities are affected by environmental changes in the Chilika Lagoon that has resulted in a reduction in the fishing catch, and therefore a reduction in livelihoods. And one of the consequences of that has been that there has been migration out from the communities. The first social identity that really becomes dominant here is the identity of gender. Women are much more likely to stay in the city, or excuse me, in the village, and men are much more likely to migrate out. And this is actually common across fisher communities where we tend to see very gendered livelihoods. Women are more likely to be engaged in the processing of fish, and men are more likely to be engaged in fishing. And with that gendered labor, we tend to also see a gendered response to environmental change. Women would also not only maintain the household while the men were away, but would also try to engage in alternative income generation. But the opportunities that were available to women are not only shaped by their gender, but also shaped by which caste they belong to. So the women who belonged to the Kandra caste engaged in a number of livelihood strategies outside of the home, including local daily migrations as wage laborers to other villages. For the Katya women, that was not a possibility because their particular social identity, their caste, did not permit or did not allow that kind of outmigration. So they were expected to engage in livelihoods that were connected only to domestic labor. So when Katya women migrated, it was typically only as part of a family migration. As a result, when they engaged in livelihood strategies, they would be livelihood strategies attached to their domestic activities. And as a result, they were more likely to be engaged in local self-help groups. So the strategies that women engaged in were shaped not only by gender, but also shaped by their caste, their social class, showing how gender and social class intersected, or caste intersected in this context. This would be an example of intersectionality and how that intersects or interacts with opportunities for migration. So mobility is affected by these multiple social identities, which determine not only who can migrate, but what kinds of migration are available to them. So in the previous example, migrating out on a daily basis was in fact available to women from the Kandra community, even though it was not available to women who were of the Katya caste. It also determines when people are allowed to migrate. So at what cycle, at what point in their life. In many communities, women who have young children cannot migrate, but may be able to migrate if their children are older or if they have no children. It also can determine where they can migrate to. So an example from Mitra and her colleagues who were looking at farmers responding to environmental degradation found that Muslim farmers had to migrate longer distances to travel to cities where they would not be discriminated against as a function of their religion. So their religion determined which settings were appropriate for their migration or were available to them for migration. And as I noted, the other way in which migration and intersectionality come into play is that new identities are being generated through migration. The identity of migrant. As I had noted, when you look at fisher communities, one of the most striking findings is that even though at a global level, women make up a large proportion of migrants, including migrants who migrate on their own, among fisher communities, migration tends to be highly gendered. Who stays behind? Women stay behind, but not just women, older adults of both genders, children, people whose ability to move is in somehow limited by their physical abilities. But we also see that the opportunities for migration and the pressure to migrate is affected by the conditions that one is living in. So with really severe loss of livelihood, we start to see an increase in women migrating on their own. So even in the case of the Chilika Lagoon example from Khan and colleagues, we see that there were some women who migrated on their own from both of the villages that were under study. They represented a very small minority, but it was happening. In a study by Evertson and Vandergeest, who were looking at women's migration in Bangladesh, what they found is that in the situation of extreme environmental stressors in the Bola district, they actually were seeing relatively frequent migration among women. In some of the villages, there were reports that as many as 50% of the migrants were actually women and not just men. That decision, in part, may have been, again, because of the severity of the situation, the lack of alternative income sources for the women in these villages, and also perhaps because the communities that were under study were not necessarily traditional fisher communities, but in many cases were communities who had been farmers and who had moved into fishing after they had lost their livelihoods in farming. So their attachment to fishing may not have been as so strong as part of their identity. And again, even though we saw women migrating in these contexts, not all women migrated. So who migrated? It was women migrating with their husbands. It was women who were single heads of households. So these were women who were divorced or widowed in most cases. Or they were young unmarried women who were migrating on their own to provide remittances for their family back home, as well as to support themselves. Again, women who had young children were unlikely to migrate. And the other point that I want to make about women migrating versus men migrating is that because men tend to be the ones who migrate in fisher communities, with this exception noted, when the discourse around migration and gender tends to be that women are passively sitting back while men take the active or agentic choice of doing migration. But in fact, both in the Everson study and in Mitra's study, we see that women, in fact, were very actively involved in the family level decision around environmental migration. In the case of the communities in Bangladesh, the women reported very actively arguing for the choice for themselves to migrate or for their family to migrate. So taking leadership in this discussion. And in Mitra's study of farmers and migration, again in South Asia, the women and the men discussed the issue of migration together and made a joint decision as a family. I just wanted to note that the discussion around migration tends to be, and gender tends to happen primarily in South Asian research. And why it's dominant in South Asian research is not entirely clear to me, but that's where you see most of the discussions around gender and migration. The other issue that I want to raise in the discussion around migration is that the way that environmental migration originally had been conceived of is that it was a failure of adaptation to environmental change, so that people migrated because they were unable to adapt to environmental changes. Within the last 10 years, we've seen a transition to thinking about environmental migration as one of many environmental adaptations, and so a positive and adaptive response to environmental change. But with that came a framing now of the people who did not migrate as people who were trapped and left behind. So there seemed to have been a loss of reflecting on people actively choosing not to migrate. Zickrath makes a very strong argument for thinking about migration out as a choice, but also thinking about a choice that people actively make to not migrate. In her work, she's looked at people living in the Saint Louis city in Senegal, fisher communities in particular, urban fishing communities, and 2 rural villages in the Mekong River Delta in Vietnam. In her research, she tried to look at people who actively chose not to migrate, as well as people who had migrated and returned, people who were seasonal migrants, and people who had been relocated officially. In Senegal, we see a loss of livelihoods because of declining fish stocks, but we also see a long history of migration because of the pursuit of fish stocks. So traditionally, fishers, the men, would travel to other regions and long distances in order to engage in fishing. And so migration was part of the regular fishing pattern. But this has changed with environmental changes so that those migrations now tend to be longer and the distances traveled tend to be further. The other thing that we're seeing is that coastal erosion has not only harmed, or that environmental change has not only harmed livelihoods, but has also resulted in coastal erosion that has been damaging people's homes, so that homes have been destroyed by waves and storms. Despite the fact that fishers are now spending extended periods of time away from home, in many cases fishing off the coast of Mauritania, because there has been an agreement between Senegal and Mauritania to allow Senegalese fishers to fish in Mauritanian waters because the Mauritanian community is primarily agricultural. That agreement has been that the Senegalese fishers would land and process the majority of the fish in Mauritania, or a proportion of the fish in Mauritania. Now, these agreements have changed over time, and as a result of those changes, we've seen increasing amount of time spent in Mauritania for Senegalese fishers, in some cases for as many as 11 months out of the year. Nonetheless, Mauritanian fishermen say that they have no desire to move to Mauritania, even though they spend the majority of their time there. In the case of people living in the Mekong Delta, which is also very heavily affected by environmental change, and also affected not only in terms of livelihoods, but also in terms of the stability of their homes, with homes being affected by floods and by landslides or mudslides, we again see resistance to migration, but a pattern of migration. In the Mekong River Delta, what we see is, rather than international migration, as we saw in Senegal, we see internal migration, typically migration to urban or peri-urban areas, now migration happening for both women and men, and that is primarily to work in factories in the peri-urban and urban area. Older adults report not migrating, not wanting to migrate, not having an interest in permanent migration, and wanting their children to remain and to return to the Mekong Delta. One of the other interesting things that has happened in the Mekong Delta is planned relocation of individuals who are particularly impoverished and whose homes are particularly severely influenced by environmental change. What's been interesting about these planned migrations is that they are moving people in communities to new relocation communities. So individuals have an opportunity to move to these new relocation sites. They can move as a community, and they are given an opportunity to have a preferential loan to build a new home relatively close to the home that they're leaving from. Because of the short distance traveled, and because the community tends to move together, this is seen as a more acceptable option than other kinds of migration by the people who live in this community. Interestingly, this migration is associated with more stable homes, but doesn't result in any change to livelihoods. So people now often have to migrate back to the original community to engage in their previous livelihoods, and their livelihoods have not improved. They're also taking on loans, so this doesn't necessarily have a positive impact on the material well-being of the family. So what I've tried to do in describing the examples I've just talked about is to highlight that there are a number of social factors that play a role in the decision to migrate, or the ability to migrate. And that includes social norms that make it appropriate or inappropriate for people to move. That includes people's psychological willingness to move. And that also has consequences for the impact of migration, or that migration has consequences on the social fabric of the communities and on the well-being of the individuals who migrate. Jones and Boyd talk about social barriers to migration adaptation. I would perhaps reframe that as social factors, but they say that one can't really talk about environmental adaptation without thinking about the social norms and the cognitive and psychological factors that shape people's opportunities and perceptions of risks and opportunities. That's certainly true in the context of environmental migration, and has been very much a part of how I've been thinking about forced migration in a conflict context. I would also say that it's easy to underplay how important the social factors are when the material outcomes are so obvious and so pressing. When we're talking about livelihoods, when we're talking about poverty, one can lose sight of the role that social factors play. And yet, of course, social factors also play a role in constructing poverty and constructing the environmental conditions or the physical conditions people find themselves in. We find a social determinants of health framework really helpful because it really draws out the fact that we belong to different social identities, gender, caste, religion, and that the social structures that we exist in create different opportunities for us as a function of those different social groups. So different castes have opportunities for different kinds of employment, are forced into better or worse physical environments, and are therefore more or less susceptible to environmental change, can be exploited by others because the nature of social relationships are also framed by these social structures that create discrimination, exploitation, and conflict. And while we tend to focus very much on the material outcomes of these social conditions, so the kinds of work and life conditions that people are exposed to that have a direct impact on one's health and well-being, one's morbidity and one's mortality, there are also psychological consequences and social consequences of these social relationships and these social norms. And we think of these as both stress in terms of dealing with the difficult physical conditions we find ourselves in, but also the stress in dealing with discrimination and differences in social status. And those stressors are also powerful determinants of one's physical health and well-being. Psychological stress has a physical impact. It results in physiological dysregulation that affects our immune systems, our inflammatory systems, our cardiovascular and metabolic systems. It even results in epigenetic changes that can result in changes in how our bodies respond to our environment. So it changes how we physically interact with our environment. And so the long-term and short-term consequences of psychological stress is also increased morbidity, increased mortality, and decreased well-being. And I raise this just to say that one shouldn't dismiss the importance of these social factors, not just in terms of how they shape the decisions that we make and the opportunities that we have, but also because they have a direct impact on our psychological well-being and our physical well-being. So what are the social and psychological impacts that I would like to focus on in terms of environmental migration? These are the ones that have been found to play the largest role in one's psychological and physical well-being, and also play a very large role in the kinds of choices that we make. Because they have a strong impact on our psychological well-being, they also have a strong impact on the choices that we make. And so there's a circular relationship between these factors as both causes and consequences of environmental migration. I want to talk about these in the context of identity. And here, when I talk about identity, I am talking about one's social status, but also one's exposure to stigma and the nature of one's social relationships with others. I want to talk about the strength and nature of one's social networks and relationships. So I'm talking here about social bonds, but also about the strength of communities. And I'm talking about feelings of belonging. So this is both social inclusion and attachment. We talk about attachment in terms of attachment to a physical location. This is also part of a sense of belonging. So environmental migration can be associated with stigmatized identities. The identity of migrant in and of itself tends to be stigmatized. In our work with refugees, there tends to be a rejection of the term refugee. So they would prefer that one speak of people who have experienced forced migration rather than people who are refugees, because you are then attaching a stigmatized identity to somebody. And environmental migrants, just as migrants who are migrating across international boundaries because of conflict, experience discrimination and harassment because they are migrants. So part of the migration process for environmental migrants is that as they are trying to navigate new livelihoods, they are experiencing harassment, stigma, discrimination, and exploitation because of their migration status, because they are outsiders, and because the role of migrant is in and of itself stigmatized. For men, this has impacts in terms of all of the factors that I've talked about. For women, this stigma exists not just in the communities they may migrate to, but also in the communities that they have migrated from. So in the study of women migrants in Bangladesh, the communities that women had migrated from also talked about how they viewed women migrants, depending on the kind of labor that they undertook. That was typically either working as housemaids, in which case they tended to be seen as women who were victimized in their roles, but also potentially victims of sexual harassment. or as women who were city girls and therefore not able to maintain purdah and not able to maintain appropriate physical covering while working, not able to maintain appropriate physical distance from men in their work conditions, and therefore is potentially immoral. So they returned with a stigmatized identity to the communities that they had left from. There was also a loss or damage to the pre-existing identities. For men, migration, forced migration or displacement because of environmental degradation is often associated with a loss of status. They have a loss of status in the community they've left because they have had to leave because they were unable to support their family. They are unable to protect the women in their family and the children in their family. And so their role as a man is challenged. When the entire family migrates, the ability to sustain a viable income is often very difficult for migrants and for male migrants. Certainly in the Canadian context, we see this, but we see this with environmental migration, with many of the people who migrate in order to respond to livelihood loss, struggling to find adequate employment as laborers in construction in the new communities that they've migrated to because of the stigma that we've just identified. So they lose status in the community they've left behind because they lose their ability to support their family. Women can maintain their traditional roles of a mother and a wife, maintaining the household, so that the impact of migration on one's traditional identities can be greater for men than it is for women in the context of environmental migration. There is also intergroup conflict. So the environmental migration, which changes social relationships and changes social status, can also result in conflict because it changes the relationships between groups, both in the communities that people migrate into because they come in as outsiders, but also when they return to the community, they may now start engaging in behaviors that were considered inappropriate or unacceptable in previous situations. So that change of social roles and opportunities that can come with livelihood diversification can also result in intergroup conflict, both in the communities that people migrate to, but also in the communities people have migrated from. Interestingly, the experience of environmental migration for women in particular also tends to be associated with positive new roles, particularly for those women who have stayed behind. And this is a part of livelihood diversification. This is an example of an interview from women who had stayed behind when their husbands migrated out in agricultural communities. And this woman is saying, you know, I got married as a child. Earlier, like all other women, I also worked in the fields. I do so even now. Most women continue with all of their traditional activities and add livelihood diversification to those activities. So we see an increase in their roles. Even though we see an increase in the burden on these women, there are these new identities that are being formed. So to continue with this quote, none of us went to market, it was the job of men. But now, negotiating with the traders, going to the market, gives us a sense of identity and recognition. So even though there's a burden of additional tasks, women talk about the new identities and the new recognition that they get in their new roles, so that this impact can be positive as well as negative. In terms of impact on social networks and relationships, migration almost always disrupts social networks. It rips families apart and it displaces communities so that parts of communities are removed. With migration, one loses material and emotional resources. Social networks are a form of social capital. You can use those social networks to access both material resources and to access emotional resources. Social networks are important. We tend to follow those social networks in migration pathways. So we go to where we know other people, or we travel with people we know in order to try to retain those social networks because they're such important resources. This also means that people are reluctant to leave those networks. And that's particularly true for older adults. So again, there's an intersectionality piece here where older adults may be so reluctant to lose those networks that they may resist even powerful forces that would push people to migration. So this is one of the interviews that Zigraf did in the Mekong Delta. And she said she had asked about whether this older individual would migrate, and they said, no, never. And they said, well, what about your children? Do you think your children should migrate? And the respondent said, no, I don't want them to go far away. No, they can live here. When there are troubles, we can help each other. No, never anywhere else. Never. The social network is seen as the strongest and most important element. What happens with the disruption of these social networks is that the community starts to lose some of the resources that they normally could draw from, and that means that the community as a whole may also be more vulnerable to exploitation. And that is work that has been seen in the Chilika Lagoon by Pradeep and his colleagues, but has been seen in other communities as well. It also changes social relationships within families. And it changes gender roles in particular. As noted earlier, there can be changes to the identities of women migrants, and it changes the relationships between women. So, for example, in the example from Bangladesh, the example of women migrating out can also result in changing relationships for those women when they return. So in one of the focus groups, the participants said, we hate garments. We hate those women who come back and return from migration to garment factories. It certainly alters gender roles within marriage. Interestingly, while those gender roles change, it doesn't necessarily change in terms of increasing women's independence. In some examples that I've provided, they are engaging in new roles, but it doesn't change the amount of control they have over decisions made in the family. And in our work in Nepal, we saw that women were now engaging in marketing and independent activities, but those activities were still being decided by men from a distance, who were men who were engaged in international migration. We also see that with the change in roles, there can become increasing friction in the families, so that when the men do return, there can be increased rates of domestic violence. And when men are away, there can be increasing rates of sexual infidelity, as has been documented by Nunes in her review of fisher migration in Lake Victoria in Africa. Interestingly, this pattern of migration can also result in new social networks. So as we saw in the example from Khan et al., women started coming together to build new kinds of collective action and new kinds of collective responses. And Rao and Hans say that one of the most important responses to environmental migration is new forms of community building and network building, both in the sites of migration, but also in the sites that are left behind. And finally, belonging. One cannot underestimate the power of the need to belong, and what a strong determinant that is of whether people are willing to migrate on a permanent basis or even willing to migrate at all. And the power of belonging may play a different role for women and men in the role of migration. In the research that we have done with forced migrants in Canada, one of the things that was most striking when we asked people about what determined their sense of belonging in Canada, for men, it was actually related to their ability to participate in the labor force, to reestablish their status and their role as men. For women, it was about reestablishing their social networks, and so reconnecting with the people who mattered to them. So belonging may be determined by different things for women and for men. Also, attachment to the past, to one's ancestors, to land and geography is a very strong determinant of people's willingness to migrate at all. And this is particularly true for older adults who may feel that there are fewer opportunities for developing new senses of attachment. When asked whether they would be willing to migrate permanently to Mauritania, given that they spent more than 11 months out of the year in Mauritania every year, one of the fishermen said, absolutely not. I'm Guetnedarian. I'm Senegalese. My home is here. So what I'm trying to highlight in the examples that I've presented here is the importance of recognizing that environmental migration affects social norms, affects one's psychological and social well-being, but is also affected by these factors. They are determining factors as well as consequences. I also want to highlight the importance of looking at environmental migration from an intersectional approach and recognizing that the various different social locations shape the opportunities and the impact of environmental migration. And finally, I would like to argue for more interaction between the different kinds of migration research that is happening, because we bring different questions and different understandings, and as a result, we can enrich each other's understanding of both the drivers and the impacts of migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michaela. That was a wonderful presentation, and lots of case studies and lots of ways in which we can learn about displacement, not in only environmental spheres, but also linking it to the psychological, social spheres. And as we are experimenting and learning more and more about vulnerability and viability issues within the B2B Global Partnership, this definitely provides us more impetus to think about these things, more rigorously. So thank you very, very much. So the floor is now open for questions, and we have already started receiving a number of questions on our YouTube platform where the live streaming is taking place. So please continue to ask those questions. So what I'm going to do now is read some of the questions that we have already received, and we have roughly roughly less than 20 minutes for questions and answers. And the first question is from Ahibad Matthew. The question is, in Nigeria, the environment is conducive, but poverty and lack of jobs cause migration. So, I mean, it's a question, or it's a, point that you could probably reflect.
Yeah, I'd like to reflect to that point and to the next one, which is about the interconnectivity between economic conditions and environmental change.
Mm-hmm.
There is a very strong relationship between economic conditions and environmental change. But nonetheless, people don't always make the most economically viable response. And so understanding why people make the decisions that they make requires understanding more than just the economic impact of that decision. So it may, in fact, be more economically viable for women of the Katia caste to engage in labor outside of the home. But social norms make that a very difficult choice for them to make. So those social norms may override the economic impulse to migrate. Similarly, if one is spending 11 months out of the year in Mauritania and one's house is being destroyed by coastal storms, it might in fact make the most economic sense to live in the place where one is conducting one's livelihood. But the strong attachment and the strong social networks that one has in the place that one has come from make the most economically viable option less acceptable from a social and psychological perspective. So this is not to minimize the importance of the economic impacts, because those livelihood and economic impacts are in fact the reason that these tensions are happening. But the way that those risks and options are perceived are shaped by social and psychological factors.
Okay, yeah. And the question that you are responding to was asked by Faluke Ariola. Thank you for asking that question. And the next one is, I'm just finding it hard. What do we do in case of our economic problems? Again, from.
It's a great question. And I guess I would have to ask a question back, which is, I'm not sure if the question is, does environmental migration solve those problems? Or, and the answer is not always. Certainly, it's one adaptation, but it's not the only adaptation, and it is often not a successful adaptation. And it is successful for some and not for others. So environmental migration tends to be more successful for individuals who already have more resources to begin with, who are already of higher status, and who have a greater range of options for migration and for livelihoods following migration. So while environmental migration is one of the options or one of the responses that people make to economic problems, it often, I don't want to say often, but it certainly is a less successful strategy than many people think it will be. One of the reasons that people may overestimate the success of environmental migration is also because environmental migrants often return, and in some of the research they explicitly discuss environmental migrants returning and overstating how successful they have been on migration, partly to protect their own identities and their own roles. So in order to protect their own social status, they over-report the amount of money that they make and they under-report the hardships that they are exposed to. So people's expectations of the success of environmental migration may be inflated. People also engage in environmental migration because they feel they have no other options. So even though they know it may not be successful, they don't know what else they can do because they have few alternatives.
Yeah. The next one is from Anna Carolina. Hi, Michaela. Very interesting. I wonder, what is the role of stigma and discrimination? Is it related to resistance to change in the host identity? What are the motivations behind these behaviors?
There's an entire body of psychological literature that tries to understand stigma. We have an inherent tendency to see people in groups, to divide ourselves into us and them. And stigma and discrimination can happen because groups are actively competing for material resources. So in a situation where there are limited resources and a new group of individuals comes in from outside and starts competing for access to the same jobs or to the same natural resources, there will almost automatically be a response of conflict. And with that conflict tends to come discrimination, dehumanization, the tendency to see people in other groups as being all the same and not seeing them as individuals. And that makes it easier to attach negative stereotypes to them. But we also see it happening for symbolic reasons. So migration is often seen as a symbolic threat to the values or the security of a group, often without any exposure to the migrants. So resistance to migration often happens in a context of people talking about those people being a threat to our safety or a threat to our values without having ever encountered anybody from any of those groups. So stigma and discrimination happen for both realistic conflict reasons, that one is competing, but also for symbolic reasons where people who are not like us are seen as a threat to the things that we value. And this is a really common and prevalent phenomenon. And we spend a lot of time trying to come up with interventions that can minimize or undo this sort of stereotyping and discrimination, often with limited success, unfortunately.
And that really intensifies when people that looked like us, the people that were like us suddenly become not like so much like us, because of migration, and that really creates new dynamics within the community itself.
Yeah.
The next question is Michelle Wu. I was wondering, how much does culture influence the effects of migration, and is this finding overall generalizable?
Hi, Mitchell. Nice to see you. This is one of my former students. It was a pleasure. Wow. Culture absolutely plays a role. It plays a role in terms of shaping who can migrate, shaping the ways in which migration happens. And that comment about, is it generalizable? I think one of the only things that one can generalize about culture is that we can say that culture matters, but it matters because it makes it different for everybody. And one of the challenges of studying the impacts of migration and the drivers of migration is, in fact, that it is so complex, and that as a result of this, research which is ethnographic and very much embedded in the community, is required in order to understand the ways in which these complex factors play out. But that makes it extremely difficult to make generalizable statements. So if it's unique in every setting, how do we generalize from that? And in fact, Prateep and I met on a study where we were trying to ask that very question, which is how do we take the complexity of ground truth, of lived experience, of unique case studies, and translate that into something that we can learn from and generalize on a regional, national, or international level. And I think that what you're forced to do then is to try to think about these more general categories, like we need to ask the question about what are the social factors that shape one's opportunities? What are the kinds of psychological factors we should be reflecting on? What are the possible impacts of environmental migration, rather than being able to make clear statements of clear deterministic statements at a really fine level.
While we're waiting for more questions to flow in, I would like to ask something about your reference to forced and compelled migration. And often in the migration literature, we read about push and pull factors. How do they compare with each other, and what are the connections?
That's a good question. There are several models that really try to talk about both push and pull factors. You certainly see that in environmental migration, where the push factors are the conditions in the pre-migration setting. And those can be factors like loss of livelihoods, the loss of one's home, the fact that migration is actually an existing tradition or a common tradition, that it is considered to be socially acceptable. In those cases, less push factors, but simply qualifying factors. And pull factors are the perception that there are resources available elsewhere, or that migration is now possible, or that I'm going to migrate to this particular setting because there are people I already know. I already have social networks in that location. Both matter. I think when we talk about voluntary migration, we tend to focus more on the pull factors. And when we talk about compelled migration, we tend to focus more on the push factors. Having said that, they always play a role. In the cases of forced or compelled migration, people may have very few choices about where they go to. So the pull factors may be less dominant. There is an element of choice when we talk about pull factors, whereas when we talk about push factors, we tend to be focusing less on choice and more on people being compelled to migrate.
Maybe if I could ask one more question, before we bring it to an end, because we don't have any more questions flowing in from the audience.
I see one more question.
Oh, you see? Okay. Yeah.
But like that, I can't answer.
Oh, yeah. Certainly.
It's like, I have not worked in Indigenous communities in North America. I have worked with colleagues who have worked with Indigenous communities in other countries, but I have not personally worked with Indigenous communities in the Canadian context. And so I would be reluctant to make any statements about Indigenous communities. I don't know that I can say enough about them. I've read some of the literature, but not enough to make an informed response. But certainly, they're often living in Indigenous communities living on traditional lands are certainly in the Canadian context being exposed to a lot of environmental degradation and climate change factors. And so in the Canadian context, it is often Indigenous communities that are driving some of our research on the impact of environmental migration, or the impact of environment on migration.
And that question was from Sylvia Salas from Mexico. And so if I may ask my question, which is the reference to gender and migration mostly taking place in South Asian context, and you said that the literature says so, but is there any particular reason why it is so, and why we're seeing certain trends in that part of the world and not in other parts of the world. Is it related to research being done or not? Is the lack of research, or it is just lack of an experience in that direction?
Yeah, I'm not sure. And it's not that there isn't research on gender and migration in other contexts, but it's particularly gender environmental migration. And within the literature on gender and environmental migration, there is this reflection happening where they keep saying, it's funny that we seem to find most of the literature in South Asia. Nobody seems to have an answer to why that is. And I don't be happy to hear what other people think the reason might be. There is a sense in the environmental migration literature that there is less work on intersectionality and environmental migration beyond the observation that men are more likely to migrate than women. So, and there is an awareness of the impact of caste and poverty on environmental options, but how those intersect seems not to be taken up as frequently as it could be. So I don't know whether that literature is not being published or if it's not seen as being as relevant as some of the other factors that seem more salient. But that's where most of the literature seems to be at the moment.
Yeah. So we'll take this as the last question from Foloke Ariola. Conflicts have made it impossible for environmental migrants to return to most communities in the Nigeria Lake Chad area. Can you explain on how to handle the social structure in fisheries?
Could you when you are you asking about is it conflict within the fishery communities? The fisher communities because of environmental migration that's stopping people from returning? Is that the question?
Yeah, unfortunately, they can't speak. Yeah.
They could type maybe.
Yeah, if you could type your answer to the question.
So is it that people cannot return if they have migrated due to environment? You know, I mean, one of the I can, maybe what I'll do is I'll just assume that that's the case, and I apologize if I've misunderstood the question. But one of the things that does happen with environmental migration is that people move in while the migrants are away and start making use of the resources that they are no longer protecting or making use of. So it is, while in some cases environmental migration results in the environment essentially being less utilized, so having an opportunity to recover. In other circumstances, in many circumstances, what happens is that other people move in and start using those natural resources. So one possibility, and I don't know if that's the case here, but one of the things that we do see is that the departure of environmental migrants, even if they leave family members behind, can leave behind communities and households that are less able to resist exploitation by more powerful others. They are less able to organize, they have less access to information, or they have less power in the community. And so they lose access to those resources. And then when the environmental migrants return, what happens is they end up in conflict.
Okay.
And the comment here is that's actually not conflict in the fisher communities.
Yes.
So national insecurity. And how national insecurity, yeah. This is a conversation I wish we could have face-to-face, because I think there's a complex question here. Certainly national insecurity also forces migration, of course. It prevents return. It changes people's status. The one thing I will say about people who are forced to migrate due to conflict is that they almost never have an opportunity to integrate into the communities that they have been forced to migrate to. So they remain in a state of perpetual asylum in the vast majority of cases. Once you cross international borders, it becomes very difficult to access resources. and the securitization of migration makes you very unwelcome in most sites. I realize I'm probably not answering the question that you have asked, but like I said, I think we'd have to have a longer conversation in order for me to fully address what it is you're asking. And if you want to email me, I can put my email in the chat, and you're free to email me and we can follow up this conversation if you're interested in doing so.
Okay, no, that's really wonderful, that the interaction can go beyond this platform. So we are at time. So I would like to bring this to an end, but with a request to Seville to bring up our next month's poster. But in the meantime, I'll take the opportunity to say a huge thank you to Michaela for making time, and really engaging all of us in this new ways of thinking about vulnerability and viability. I'm speaking on behalf of the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership, but also providing not only conceptual and theoretical, directions, but also many examples and case studies that can, provide us the impetus to engage in these areas. And I'm sure a lot of graduate students who are watching this are working on the question of intersectionality in fishing communities, and they would take a lot of benefit from this and pursue this. So thank you very much. And thanks to also to our international audience, we're watching live, the live stream video on YouTube. So yes, you can watch the recorded video on our YouTube site, but at the same time, please feel free to get in touch with additional questions with our speaker of today, Dr. Michaela Hynie. So thank you to everyone. Thank you very much. So I also at the same time invite all of you to our next month's thematic webinar series. As I said, this takes place on the last Friday of every month. And the next month's thematic webinar series is being presented by two speakers, Dr. Emdad Haq from University of Manitoba in Canada, and along with Dr. Mohammed Salimuddin from University of Waterloo. And both of them are going to make a joint presentation on the work that they have been doing on post-disaster livelihood reconstruction and resilience enhancement by the small-scale fisheries and transformative changes in coastal Bangladesh. So you are all welcome, and we look forward to seeing you next month on the last Friday, which is the 27th of August on the same platform. Thank you very much, and thank you once again to Michaela for a wonderful talk.
Thank you so much for having me.